Hi, this is Professor McGuire, and welcome to this concept video in environmental policy, focusing on intuition and evidence, differences in thinking about environmental problems. By way of introduction, each of us has our own internal definition of the term environment. It's a normative term. It means different things to different people. It's subject to more than one definition. And that's certainly the case from an operational standpoint. I don't mean here a dictionary sort of definition where we can come to a general agreement on a few definitions for environment, but rather what the environment means to us, how we define it from our own experiential, that's what I mean by operational, an experiential standpoint. I have a sense of what the environment is. I can talk about the environment. I can separate it into different ways of thinking about it. I might have a definition of the natural environment, stuff that's outside of places like buildings and, whether my office that I work at or the home that I live at. But I might also identify those as their own kinds of environments, an office environment, a home environment versus a natural environment. And even then, I might identify the woods that are close to where I live as a certain kind of natural environment. And I might think that that's different from, I don't know, a park that I go to or a national park that I go to and visit once a summer that's far off. And I might think of that as a different kind of natural environment, like wilderness. And I might think of something that has a few trees or, is relatively, I have some walking trails as something less than this sort of wilderness. So we can have all these different sort of definitions of environment. And even within those definitions, we can have different ideas between us as to what we mean by environment. So we all have our own internal definition, and that definition varies. It varies across time within the same individual. It varies across subject matter, natural environment A versus natural environment B for that same person. And even it certainly varies between individuals when referring to the same place. That different people have different ideas of what that place means relative to it being an environment. So as a result of this, we conceptualize environmental issues differently. And not only just because of our own sort of how we define the environment, but the way in which that definition and other factors influence the way that we think about the environment. So it's varied, and our conceptualization is not consistent between individuals, never mind between groups as we sort of level up into society and think about having societal action. Remember, we're talking ultimately here about what choices the public makes relative to doing something or not doing something about the environment, something we call environmental policy, generally speaking. What government chooses to do and not to do, and what might be some of the consequences of those choices. So because it's so varied, not only our definitions, but our conceptualization of the environment and what are environmental issues, they are also equally varied amongst individuals, amongst groups, etc. Most of us often use our own experiences as a basis for conceptualizing environmental issues. So many times when we think about the environment, not only are we using our own sort of definitions based on our own experiences, and then the question of what is an environmental issue is very much related to our experiences. And that's sort of the way in which we formulate the notion of, is there something wrong? Another normative term. All of these terms are somewhat normative, but is there something that needs to be done? Is that just normal? That's just the way it is. We don't have to do anything actively. We don't have to manage anything actively. Very much often how we feel about what we might call an environmental issue is directly related to our experiences in both how we define and how we conceptualize the concept itself of environment. And our experience is both influences the way we think, sometimes called our values, beliefs, and norms. They all have a role to play. So it's not just how we personally, through our own individual experience, identify with the term environment, but it's also everything else that we bring along with us. Our basic values, beliefs, and norms, how we were brought up, the conditions in which we were brought up. How were we exposed to different things? How do we, as an individual, identify with different groups? And what do those groups think about questions of environment and that sort of thing? All of this is interrelated. So when we contextualize environmental problems through those individual experiences, bringing forward our values, beliefs, and norms, etc., we can conflate our intuition or how we believe things might be with actual evidence, how things actually are. Sometimes intuition and evidence can be the same thing. Sometimes we are correct in our intuition of how things might be. They are actually how they are. But often our intuition, it deceives us. And we think things are a certain way when in fact they are not that way we think. Sometimes intuition evidence is the same, but often intuition and evidence is different. And good environmental problem identification, when we talk about environmental policy, we talk about actually identifying environmental issues, good environmental problem identification and solving requires us to know the difference between intuition and evidence and what we're talking about here. So what are some of the distinctions between intuition and evidence? As far as intuition goes, we can say it's how we perceive the world through a mix of experience and associated conceptual frameworks, those values, beliefs, and norms. So in many ways, intuition is based on our own interactions. We develop our intuition over time as we have more experiences with the world, that those experiences, they sort of aggregate, we put them together, and they help us form an opinion about things based on those experiences. And often part of that is based on observations. So we see things, we observe things, things change or things stay the same relative to our own observations and experiences. So hey, I've seen this happen a few times, right? So you can often, whether you've done this yourself or you can think of other people, right? Oh, I've seen that happen a few times. And that's meant to tell you something. Like, in other words, even if it's not said, because I've seen it happen a few times, it means that that always happens under these conditions because I've seen it happen. Or that thing happens and it happens regularly because I've seen it happen. Or it's been my experience. You might have heard this, or you might have said this to yourself, or you might have said this to others, right? It's been my experience that, when A happens, then B follows, whatever that might be. So we have these sort of experiential, observational experiential ways of sort of defining ourselves and the way in which we think about the world. But those observations are not tested or otherwise subject to some kind of objective rigor. And we have to understand that's important when it comes to intuition. When we just have these observations, but those observations aren't met with any sort of rigorous testing, and we'll talk about what that might mean in some way, then they're just those observations. And those observations can just be based on circumstance. They're just circumstantial. If you only ever check your mail when it's dark out late at night, you may be under the impression that mail only comes or only exists or only gets into the mailbox at night. It may in fact be that the mail is delivered during the day, during sunlight, sun out, when the sun's out, but you don't observe that. And if you never observe that and you only go to the mailbox at night and open the mailbox at night to see mail there, then you might be under the impression that the mail only arrives or is correlated and caused by the night, that there's a relationship, a direct relationship, a strong correlation between nighttime and mail, if you knew nothing else, as one example. So this can lead us to declaring something to be true or always right without actually testing that premise. We do this all the time. We generalize our experiences. So we say we've seen something or we've had some experience, and then we generalize that and say, well, that's the way it is. Whatever I've experienced is the way that it always happens. I've always had good experiences with that person. Thus, they must be good. They must be a good person. That's one example. where, you hear this all the time in some tragic event where, the neighbors of the person who committed the tragic event will always say, well, many years I've seen that person and I've only known them to be a very nice person, a very good person. I never expect them to have engaged in these behaviors or committed this tragic event. You often hear this as an example. This comes up a lot. And that what they're doing is they're saying that my perception is what I thought the reality was. And I'm shocked to see that that person would act different than my own observations of them. Of course, I only have limited observations. That doesn't mean that those observations mean everything, that they encapsulate the entirety of that person's actions or potential actions, right? But we do this all the time. So that's intuition. Evidence, on the other hand, it requires a level of testing and accuracy that is not dependent on just our experiences. It doesn't just depend on our experiences. It tests the accuracy of those experiences or observations. So experiences or observations can be helpful in thinking about how the world might be. It's a great way to start in terms of thinking how the world might be, because you can observe what actually is occurring in certain instances. And again, they're your observations. That doesn't mean that those observations are accurate observations, right? But they give you a sense of maybe this is something that's connected, and maybe there's a connection here. So it's a good starting point, right, of how it might be. But testing those observations under various conditions, including conditions outside of your own perception, is necessary to determine if that is actually how the world is. Difference between correlation and causation is effectively what we're talking about. When you experience something, you're correlating the two things, the male, night. It doesn't mean that that male is connected in any meaningful way to nighttime. They just happen at the same time by your experience of only checking the male at night. So that's the main difference. Intuition is all about correlation, whereas evidence tries to find the causation, if at all, through the perceived correlation. Environmental problems are often only known through testing that develops rigorous evidence. So many of the things that we know that are environmental problems, both historically and today, are really only known, truly known, through this testing, this evidence-based approach. Otherwise, often they are left unknown. And this can go against our learned experience. In other words, it can be counterintuitive against that intuition. It's hard for us to think that environmental problems can occur and can happen when they can't be readily observed by our own observations, direct observations, which are not often, again, rigorous, our own unrigorous observations, what I see as I walk around kind of observations, right? Or through our own historical perspectives and experiences. Well, it seems like everything's fine. The air seems just as clean as it always was. That water, I don't know, it seems about the same. Stuff around it seems the same. I can't perceive any major differences in the quality of that water if anything's happening to it. So again, the difference between evidence and intuition. So intuition to evidence. What are we looking at here? We can maybe think about it in terms of thinking intuition is really observation that then leads us to some ultimate conclusion. We have our own perceptions, our own experiences, our own observations, and those observations then help with our value, beliefs, and norms. They get filtered through our own selves, our own sense of what we believe, why we believe what we believe, and other things. And we sort of have a mathematical sort of process in our own heads when we observe something, filter it through our own personal value, beliefs, and norms, and then we come to some sort of conclusion. And that conclusion can become hard. It's a conclusion that we hold on to. It's a belief more than a conclusion, but it's a belief that we hold on to. And that's what I mean by ultimate conclusion. We deem it to be an ultimate conclusion. Every time I see that, that's the conclusion. Whereas evidence is really about more steps in the process where we have observations. And that's always a fine place to start. Sometimes we don't even have observations. Sometimes we just have people coming up with hypotheses, best guesses. They'll just guess, hey, I believe that I'm going to take a wild guess here and think that under these conditions, this will happen, without any observation. Observation is always helpful because then it can help inform, well, has that ever happened under any circumstances, under any version of observation, right? Under any sort of personal observation. That can be helpful in developing the hypothesis because it makes it more likely under certain circumstances that you would actually, there's some basis for the hypothesis, for the guess, the best guess. But anyway, we can start with observations. We don't necessarily have to. Thinking of the scientific method here for those that understand that. We can start with observations, and then those observations might lead us to some guesses about how the world might work. And that leads to maybe a hypothesis, which is a working sort of theory. And then you test. The key is you test that working theory here. And that testing helps you get to some, not an ultimate conclusion, but some understanding as to whether or not that hypothesis is valid. It might be valid all the time. Rarely that's the case. It might be valid under certain conditions. It might be partially valid. It might be proven wrong, which then the null hypothesis might be proven true, the opposite of the hypothesis, right? That kind of thing. And that leads us ultimately anyway to a partial conclusion, something that helps us better understand the world without saying that we understand completely, because there are always variables, there are always things. It's a very dynamic world, and particularly when we're talking about our environment, if we think of the Earth system as our environment at the largest scale, there are a lot of variables, a lot of dynamics that, things that we can't necessarily control for. But under certain circumstances, the things we can control for, we can come to some sort of better understanding. This second one here, observation to hypothesis through testing to partial conclusion, is more of the evidence that we're talking about when we talk about environmental policy and the kinds of problems, identifying environmental problems, and then thinking about why humans need to do something, take some action relative to that problem. So this is more of what we're talking about rather than this idea of intuition, which is really just, I've seen something, I've seen it the same way, and therefore that's the way it is. My observations have told me that's the ultimate truth. So why is this important? Why is it important to know this? First, environmental problems are often not obvious. They don't show themselves immediately and directly to us. We can't see the problem. We can't detect the problem, particularly in our sort of random, basic, observations, day-to-day observations, the kind of intuition associated observations. Many of them are based on aggregations over time, where actions accumulate to cause harm. Those that have watched any of the other videos, we talk about the idea of margins and some others, particularly in the concept videos, but certainly in any of the subject matter videos, you'll see, climate change is the perfect example, but there's many others. Our whole history, if you look at the environmental law, the videos on environmental law, you'll see most of our historical identification of major problems in the United States and certainly in other countries is as we measure for air quality, right? We measure things that aren't easy to see, aren't easy to identify. We need special measuring techniques. Water quality, same thing. It's hard to see some of the chemicals that leach into water that are maybe human created, that are then really not good for human well-being, right? And then therefore in that way degrade the quality of the water. These are things, and it's not just something that happens where it's one molecule of carbon. Oh no, we have a problem. It's something that aggregates over time. Climate change is a good example because we take carbon from one place that's stored in the earth and we actively remove it and place it into another place, in particular the atmosphere. And those extra molecules of carbon combined with other elements to create compounds, a variety of compounds. Those extra molecules of carbon don't displace the existing molecules of carbon in the atmosphere, so that we increase over time the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere in a way that makes the Earth different than what we're used to. Now, we don't observe that. It's not easily observable. It's something that has to be detected by using special techniques. It's not something you and I, through our intuition, through our basic casual observations, would be able to identify. So it's something that's tricky. And the fact that it aggregates means that it builds up, and it builds up in a way that makes it worse over time. So that the problem is something that, since we can't see it casually, and that it builds up over time, it gets worse, and then maybe we don't observe any of the negative consequences until it's really, really bad. If we're only relying on our intuition, our ability to personally, casually observe these things. So because of that, many of these environmental problems are these kinds of aggregations where the actions accumulate to cause harm. Think of aging as an example, if it's hard to understand some of the environmental corollaries or examples. We don't see the process of aging every day. Aging's a cumulative process, right? Each day aggregates with the last over time. So you don't see the ultimate expression of aging for a long period of time. But every day you're aging. If you looked at yourself in the mirror, some of you might have seen, this was popular a few years back anyway, where people would take a photo of themselves every day, and they had done it for a year or 2 years or 3 years. And then they, will then create a sort of a summary where over a short period of time, they will just a quick video where you'll see the day-to-day progression of that individual over a number of years. And you can see, even then though, even over a year, there's not much difference. There might be difference in hair size. They might grow a beard if it's, if they identify as male and they grow a beard, facial hair, that kind of thing. Whatever it is, there are ways of showing difference. But ultimately, the notion of aging, you only see that over long periods of time. From a day-to-day standpoint, you see no change. So your observations would be deceiving. As a matter of fact, if you never saw an old person, you had no concept of age. Think of it. If you lived in a vacuum, if you lived in a bubble, and you never had and were never taught and never learned any value, beliefs, and norms relative to aging and that humans age, you would not think that you would be fundamentally different on a day-to-day basis. You would look at yourself in the mirror, and for all intents and purposes, your belief probably would be that that's how you would look, and you would continue to look that way. You would have no strong conception of aging. And it would only be over a very long period of time that you could then maybe look at yourself and say, oh yes, I am fundamentally different. I look fundamentally different than I did many days ago, many days ago. So that's maybe one way to understand the difference between this idea of, base observations and actual testing of evidence. Smoking is a different example. Harm comes from smoking many cigarettes each day for many years. We don't, quote, see the harm until it reaches a tipping point, right? So there's another example where many environmental problems are like this. It's something that we cannot casually observe on an incremental basis. But over long periods of time, we know, and we only know this through more objective evidence, scientific-based evidentiary mechanisms, that in fact we age over time, right? I mean, this is known through, again, this is now placed because aging is so obvious from a societal standpoint, recorded history, etc., that we know this because it's imbued into our value, beliefs, and norms. But it's only until more recently that we know the dangers of smoking, the long-term dangers of smoking, through a lot of scientific study. We've known aging so now smoking recently, in the past few decades, has been imbued into our value, beliefs, and norms as a society, as a culture, at least for most of us. Some of us still might discount or disbelieve the dangers of smoking cigarettes. They might not have accepted that into their own personalized value, beliefs, and norms, and they might find other people that have not accepted that into their collective group value, beliefs, and norms, and then they find, comfort in that, and they find that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that their own personal beliefs are matching with reality, and that's where the evidence comes in and is so important. Often our experiences by themselves can give us a false sense of reality. This is why a deeper exploration of environmental issues is necessary. We need to develop evidence to ensure we are not deceiving ourselves. That's the whole point. And that's what's really important when it comes to evidence-based environmental policy. So as a summary of intuition and evidence, thinking about this as a concept of intuition versus evidence, or intuition and evidence. One thing we can say for sure is that we think we know more than we do. I summarize one of these other concept videos with the first point and identifying that we don't know everything. And that's just the truth, right? But even though we don't know everything, far from it, we actually think we know more than we do. And that's problematic. Our intuitions are powerful and often are a major part of how we make personal day-to-day decisions. Sometimes those are called heuristics. Heuristics are decision-making tools that we use that are not quantitatively developed, but are more qualitative in nature. So our experiences are really important from day to day in making decisions because they historically and maybe even likely have evolved to protect us. While they can be helpful in avoiding worst case outcomes, they often do not reflect reality. As an example, I avoid the person or place that looks scary to me. That's a heuristic I have. It's embedded in me. It might be part of my history. I might have had a bad experience, or I simply, even if I didn't have a bad experience, I was taught from a young age by my parents and others in my community to be wary of people and places that look scary. However scary is defined, right? So I have built into my personal decision-making that however I define scary, if I find a person or place that meets that definition, I avoid it. That helps me avoid potential trouble. The good news is, again, why this is important is if I avoid anything that looks scary to me, I'm more likely to avoid anything that might be troubling. But just because I avoid something or someone that looks scary to me, that does not mean that that person or place that was avoided was actually problematic, actually trouble. So the problem with our heuristic here is that we're going to say, oh, I'm smart because every place that I avoided, every person or place that I defined as scary was in fact scary. And the fact of the matter is that's simply not the truth. So that's where the heuristic, while it can be very beneficial in avoiding worst case scenarios, is very problematic when we want to get to the heart of truth, when we want to get closer to something that's objectively true. This kind of thinking carries over into our thinking about other issues, certainly the environment, that term that we each operationally define for ourselves. So it's really important to understand this notion of intuition and evidence relative to not only just in general, how we go about making decisions and how that should be separated from something we think of as a more objective truth, but then how we apply that process to thinking about and even defining environmental problems. Okay. That's it on this section. I hope this concept video of intuition and evidence was helpful in giving you a better understanding of how we might apply these concepts to environmental problems. Thank you.